Hello, and welcome to our channel, a place where stories about people and history are told more slowly. Slow enough for you to breathe deeply and let the outside world gently drift away. Before we begin, I want to ask you a very simple question. Have you ever met someone with albinism, or maybe you've had a friend or someone you once knew who was albino? It could have been a child in your neighborhood, a classmate from years ago. Or maybe you've never met anyone at all, only seen them briefly in photographs online, or heard about them in stories told quietly, almost in a whisper. And if you have met someone, you might still remember that first impression. Not because they did anything unusual, but because the light seemed to reach them differently. Very pale skin, hair that was almost white, eyes that reacted more strongly to the sun. And in that brief moment, many of us found ourselves wondering, even if we never said it out loud, why are they different? Tonight, we're not telling a story about magic. We're not talking about superpowers. We won't glorify and we won't sensationalize. Tonight, we're telling a very human story. A story about people who were born into bodies, missing something that evolution spent millions of years developing: melanin, the pigment that helps protect human beings from sunlight. This is a story that begins with biology, moves through history, and touches fear, misunderstanding, and the myths people created long before science had the language to explain them. And before you close your eyes, I'd like to invite you to do one small thing. Leave a comment. It doesn't have to be long. Just tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. Maybe you're in a quiet room, on a late-night drive, or somewhere very far away where the lights have already gone out. We in different places across the world will listen together to a story about people who have spent their lives in a world that was never designed with them in mind. Now, let your shoulders soften, slow your breathing, and let the story begin. Right now, as you're listening to these words in some quiet space somewhere on Earth, a child has just been born. And in that very moment, the child's body is already telling a story that is different from the rest of humanity. Not through words, not through actions, but through absence. That child is born with very pale skin, hair that is almost white, eyes that cannot tolerate strong light. And inside that small body, there is something that millions of years of human evolution have quietly assumed would always be there, but isn't. Melanin, a short word, yet the condensed result of millions of years of biological history. Melanin is not something humans invented. It is something humans were shaped alongside. From the moment our earliest ancestors stepped out of the protective shade of African forests and into open landscapes where the sun was no longer filtered by leaves, melanin began to take on a vital role, not as decoration for the body, but as a silent survival mechanism working every second, every day throughout an entire lifetime. Under the harsh sunlight of deserts, melanin thickened. In humid forests, where light scattered through dense canopies, melanin adjusted just enough. On high plateaus where radiation is stronger and air thinner, melanin shifted in yet another rhythm. And near icy regions where sunlight is weak and scarce, melanin gradually decreased so the body could absorb more vitamin D from the little sun that remained. Melanin does not recognize race. It only responds to environment. Over tens of thousands of years, the human body learned to fine-tune this pigment like a very slow, very patient dial, turned generation by generation. There were no sudden jumps, no changes within a single lifetime, only the quiet accumulation of time. And because of that, human skin became a living map. A map that records where ancestors lived, the light they faced, and the pressures the environment placed upon their bodies. Melanin absorbs ultraviolet radiation, something capable of damaging DNA if left unchecked. It lowers the risk of cellular mutation. It protects the structure of the skin. It prevents the body from being silently harmed beneath sunlight that seems harmless. But melanin does not stop at the skin. It appears in hair-determining shades from deep black to brown blonde and red. It exists in the eyes, influencing iris color and the way light enters the retina. It participates in visual development in how the brain learns to process images. In subtle but profound ways, melanin helps humans see the world, not just endure it. And so, throughout most of human evolutionary history, melanin was never questioned. It was always there, always present, always taken for granted like breathing or a heartbeat, until a child is born, whose body does not produce melanin in the usual way, not because the body forgot, not because something was taken away, but because a very small genetic sequence, very small, did not operate the way millions of others had before it. An enzyme fails to activate at the right moment. A synthesis pathway is interrupted. Melanin does not appear or appears in quantities too small to fulfill its role. And so, in a world built on the assumption that all humans possess pigment, that child enters life without this silent biological shield. That child is albino. There is no dramatic change in that moment, no flash of light, no warning sign, only that from the earliest days, sunlight makes those tiny eyes hard to open. Skin reddens more easily, and reactions most people never think about become things this child must learn to live with. Albinism is not the complete absence of color. It is the absence of a protective mechanism. And because of that, albinism is not just a story about appearance. It is a story about being born into a body that evolution did not fully adjust for the present environment. Throughout history, humans like to believe evolution creates optimal designs. But the truth is, evolution is only good enough to survive, not perfect. It does not correct every deviation immediately. It does not eliminate every difference. It simply keeps what is not dangerous enough to disappear entirely. And so albinism exists, not as a sign, not as a message, but as a quiet reminder that the human body is not a single, unified design. Some bodies are born to withstand intense sunlight. Some are born to thrive better in shade. And some are born having to avoid what the rest of humanity calls normal. That child grows up in a world where light is both life and challenge. A world where their skin causes others to look twice. A world where difference cannot be hidden, even if one wants to. And from that moment on, the story of albinism is no longer just biological. It becomes social. A story of gazes, of how people react when confronted with a body that does not follow what they believe to be standard. But all of this begins with a very small word, melanin. From the very first moments of light, the thing most people never need to consider becomes something to be cautious of. Throughout human history, light has always carried two meanings at once. It is life. The sun that warms, feeds crops, regulates biological rhythms. But it is also pressure, something the human body must learn to manage, adapt to, and eventually tame. Melanin is evolution's answer to that problem. When humans left the forests of Africa, where sunlight fell almost vertically year-round, melanin became a biological shield. It absorbed radiation. It reduced DNA damage. It protected skin cells from errors that could lead to cancer. Over hundreds of thousands of years, the body fine-tuned melanin like a control knob, more in intense sunlight, less where light was weak, but never entirely absent, until albinism appeared, not as a decision, not as progress, but as a very small misalignment in heredity. A gene that does not function correctly, an enzyme not produced in sufficient quantity, a biochemical chain interrupted, and the result is that melanin once assumed indispensable vanishes. Evolution does not stop to explain this. It does not attach a footnote. It simply moves on, leaving albino individuals to live in a world designed for the majority, not for them. In modern times, with medical terminology, classifications, and data, we call this albinism a recessive genetic condition, meaning a person can carry the gene for a lifetime without ever knowing until two carriers meet and a child is born with full expression. But before science had language, humans had only imagination. And human imagination, when facing the unusual, is rarely neutral. In many ancient societies, extremely pale skin was seen as a sign of divinity, children of the sun messengers from another realm. Elsewhere, it inspired fear. Because a body that does not resemble the rest of the community raises the most dangerous question humans can ask. Does this person truly belong to us? That question does not need to be spoken. It exists in the stare, in pauses between conversations, in slowed footsteps when sunlight hits a too white body among darker skin. And this immediate visibility, something Rh negative individuals do not have, makes albino people different instantly. No tests required, no analysis needed, no science involved. Only light. Light makes albino individuals squint. Light causes tears. Light makes skin vulnerable, and quietly light also makes them the center of misinterpretation. Because humans are not comfortable accepting difference without assigning meaning. We want to know why. And when answers are unavailable, we create stories. Some say albino people carry special destinies. Some believe they carry curses. Some whisper that they are not fully human. These stories are rarely born of pure malice. Most arise from fear of what disrupts the familiar order of the world. Because if someone can be born missing what evolution spent millions of years building, we are forced to face an unsettling truth. Evolution does not guarantee fairness. It does not guarantee perfection. And it does not care about individual comfort. Albinism is not a choice, not a sign, not a secret message from the universe. It is simply a quiet branch on the human genetic tree. Yet that small branch bears an enormous social weight. From childhood, many albino individuals must learn a skill most people never realize they use, learning to slow down in sunlight, not mentally, not developmentally, but physically, in every small movement, every minor decision. In the morning, while other children simply put on shoes and run outside, an albino child pauses. A hat pulled lower. Sunscreen applied carefully, not for appearance, but because skin can burn quickly. Midday sun, pleasant to others, becomes cumulative pressure. At school, reflected light from concrete and white walls forces eyes to work harder. Melanin doesn't only protect skin, it filters light for vision. Without it, the world becomes too bright, too sharp, too overwhelming. Squinting is not discomfort, it is survival. And that squint small and unconscious is often misunderstood. Some think it's avoidance, some think it's shyness, some think it's disengagement. Few recognize it as a body adapting in its own way. These habits persist into adulthood, avoiding prolonged sun-seeking shade, adjusting lighting, sitting closer to boards due to visual limitations. Small adjustments repeated daily, shaping how one moves through the world. And then there are things harder to avoid than sunlight. Other people's eyes. Albino individuals rarely need introductions. Their appearance arrives first. In unfamiliar rooms, gazes linger. Sometimes curiosity, sometimes surprise, sometimes pity, sometimes unspoken distrust. Questions begin early. Why are you so white? Why is your hair like that? What's wrong with your eyes? Are you sick? Most questions are not cruel. Many come from innocent curiosity. But repetition leaves marks not because of content, but implication. That you are different. That your body does not match normal. That you must explain your existence more than others. Some learn scripted answers, some stay silent, some laugh, some avoid. No approach is right or wrong, only different ways to protect oneself. Inside, many grow up with a quiet feeling, constant adjustment. Adjusting light, distance, how others look at them, how they look at themselves. In a world designed for sun-tolerant bodies, albino individuals learn to live in shade not because they are fragile, but because their bodies require different care. That difference, small biologically, becomes large socially. In some places, it remains inconvenience. In others, it becomes burden, teasing, false stories, being treated as a curiosity rather than a person. From these everyday experiences, myths form. When someone squints at light, others imagine seeing differently. When bodies differ, meaning is imposed. Stories are woven not because albino people want to be different, but because society struggles to accept difference without explanation. But look closer and the truth is simple. Albino people do not live slower by choice. They live slower because the world demands it. And in that slower pace lie things others often miss: attention to detail, environmental awareness, a direct relationship with one's body, something many only notice when it begins to fail. That is not a superpower, not a mystical gift. Over time, these questions accumulate into a familiar sense that the world was not built with them in mind. Just as Rh-negative individuals once felt biologically out of sync, albino people grow up sensing they must adapt more, not because they are weaker, but because the environment never adjusted for them. This chapter is not about pain. It lays the groundwork for a deeper question. Why do such people persist through history? Why does a condition that increases vulnerability to sunlight, the basis of life, not disappear? And deeper still, what happens when science is silent, but society speaks first? In the chapters ahead, we will follow that path from biology to history, misunderstanding to myth, fear to responsibility. But before moving on, let this question rest gently, like evening light. If evolution does not create humans to be perfect, then is difference, even vulnerable difference, truly a mistake? And with that question, we move into the next chapter. In the previous part, we talked about what it feels like for an albino person to live under sunlight, about the ordinary things that repeat every day, quietly shaping a different way of existing. But to understand why those experiences happen, why light becomes a challenge from early childhood, we have to return to a deeper starting point where there is no social gaze, no prejudice, no myth. Only pure biology working in silence long before a human being can even cry for the first time. Albinism in medical language is called albinism. And right from this starting point, science draws a very clear boundary. Albinism is not a contagious disease, not a result of climate, sunlight, diet, or living environment, and not the outcome of any choice or behavior made by the parents. There is no moral failure here, no lifestyle fault, no hidden karma, no punishment. Albinism is a genetic condition, meaning it is determined very early, at a time when a human being has no form, yet no heartbeat, yet no concept of the world around them. When genes begin to arrange, combine, and activate to build a human body, the information for albinism is already there, silent, precise, and non-negotiable. At that stage, there is no light skin or dark skin, no blue eyes or brown eyes. There are only tiny biological codes tightly coiled in DNA, carrying instructions for how each cell will work, which proteins will be produced, and how each chemical reaction will unfold. These codes cannot be seen with the naked eye, and cannot be sensed by our ordinary senses. Yet they decide very visible realities, later on the color of skin under sunlight, the shade of hair as a child grows, the way eyes respond to brightness. Albinism, therefore, does not appear as a sudden event in a child's life. It is part of the biological blueprint from the very first moment. To truly understand albinism, we have to understand melanin, because it sits at the center of this entire story. Melanin is often imagined in a simple way, as if it were only the color of the skin, a pigment layer painted over the body, like paint on an object's surface. But in biological reality, melanin is far more complex and precise. It is not sitting on the surface like a coat. It is produced deep inside the body, inside specialized cells called melanocytes. These cells live in multiple places in the basal layer of the skin, in hair follicles, and within the structures of the eye, especially in the retina. Melanin is the final product of a long biochemical pathway, where many different enzymes participate step by step. Each enzyme plays a very specific role, like a worker on a highly coordinated assembly line. Some enzymes begin the process, some convert raw materials into intermediate forms, and some finish the final product. This pathway does not allow major mistakes. If just one enzyme is not produced correctly, or if it functions less effectively than necessary, the entire melanin-making process can slow down, break, or stop altogether. This is where albinism appears. In a person with albinism, the problem is not that the body forgets to make melanocytes. The problem is that the biochemical assembly line inside those cells does not function fully. Genes involved in enzyme production are altered, so the enzymes are missing or do not work effectively. As a result, melanin is not produced in the amount the body needs. Sometimes melanin is almost absent. Sometimes it appears, but in quantities too small to carry out its biological function. And that function is not merely about color. Melanin acts as a natural shield protecting the body from ultraviolet radiation from sunlight. It absorbs and disperses the energy of radiation, reducing damage to DNA within skin cells. At the same time, in the eye, melanin helps regulate the amount of light entering the eye, supporting the precise development of the retina and visual pathways. When melanin is lacking, it is not only pigmentation that changes, protection and regulation weaken as well. One point matters deeply here: a person with albinism is not someone who is missing a part of the body's structure. They do not lose pigment cells. Melanocytes are still present in the skin, hair, and eyes. But inside those cells, the production of melanin does not happen completely. It is a very small difference at the molecular level, yet it creates very large differences at the level of the whole body, large enough to make a person stand out in a crowd, large enough to draw social attention, and sometimes large enough to generate stories that go far beyond biology. Seen this way, albinism is not mysterious. It is not magic, and it is not a curse. It is the result of an incomplete biological process, a genetic variation among countless variations carried by human beings. But because melanin is directly tied to the most visibly obvious features, skin color, hair color, eye appearance, albinism is rarely treated as a normal biological phenomenon. Instead, it is often placed under the bright light of curiosity, fear, and mistaken interpretation. And from here, the story can no longer remain only about genes or enzymes. When a biological difference steps out of the lab and into social life, it begins to carry new meanings. Those meanings are not written in DNA. They are written in the way people look at one another, judge one another, and tell stories about one another. It is precisely at this border between pure biology and human interpretation that albinism becomes a story far larger than its original scientific nature. This point is extremely important because it helps us dismantle one of the oldest misunderstandings. A person with albinism is not a human being missing a part of their body. They have not lost pigment cells. They simply carry a genetic variation that causes the biochemical pathway inside the cells to function differently. And that tiny molecular difference leads to very visible differences at the level of the body. Albinism is also not a single, uniform condition. In medicine, it is classified into multiple forms. The most common is oculocutaneous albinism, and another form is ocular albinism. In oculocutaneous albinism, melanin deficiency affects the skin hair and eyes together. Skin is very light hair, ranges from pale blonde to white, and the eyes are sensitive to bright light. In ocular albinism, melanin deficiency is concentrated mainly in the eyes, while the skin and hair may be only slightly lighter than other family members. This diversity explains why not all people with albinism look the same. Some are immediately recognizable. Others appear only subtly different. But regardless of outward appearance, the biological mechanism remains the same principle. Melanin is not produced sufficiently to perform its intended function. One of the most important consequences of reduced melanin appears in vision. Melanin does not only determine iris color, it plays a key role in the development of the retina and the visual pathways from the eyes to the brain. When melanin is lacking, eye structure may develop differently, leading to vision that is weaker than average. Many people with albinism have difficulty seeing fine detail, especially at a distance. They may experience mild nystagmus, small involuntary eye movements, difficulty keeping a steady gaze, and strong sensitivity to bright light. These features are often misunderstood. An albino child in a classroom may be judged as unfocused, constantly looking down or avoiding eye contact. In reality, the child may simply be trying to control light in order to see more clearly, or avoiding discomfort caused by brightness. Intelligence is not affected by albinism, but visual difficulty can easily be mistaken for cognitive limitation, especially in educational settings that lack knowledge or support. Genetically, most forms of albinism are recessive traits. That means a person can carry the gene for albinism without showing any visible signs. They may live their entire life like anyone else, never knowing that a genetic variant exists in their DNA, until that same variant is inherited from a partner and a child is born with albinism. This is why albinism can appear suddenly in a family with no clear history. Parents appear entirely typical. Siblings may show no signs. And the birth of an albino child can leave families confused, worried, and even blaming themselves. In societies with limited medical knowledge, that empty space of understanding is easily filled by incorrect explanations, spiritual narratives, stigma, or social prejudice. One point needs to be stated plainly: albinism is not infectious. An albino person does not carry a risk to others through touch food or shared daily life. And yet throughout history, some communities have isolated albino people, believing their appearance to be a sign of illness or danger. That fear does not come from biology. It comes from misunderstanding and from a very human reflex when faced with something unfamiliar. From an evolutionary perspective, albinism raises a question that confuses many people. Melanin is an important protective mechanism under sunlight. Reduced melanin means higher risk of sun damage, skin cancer, and vision problems. So why has a condition like this not been completely eliminated through tens of thousands of years of evolution? The answer lies in how evolution actually works. Evolution does not optimize for individual comfort. It does not care about inconvenience or difficulty within a single lifetime. It only needs the population to continue. A recessive gene can remain hidden across many generations without producing obvious consequences at the population level. It is not beneficial enough to be strongly selected for, but also not harmful enough to be fully eliminated. And so, it remains silently, patiently, like countless other variants in the human genome. This leads to an important realization. Albinism is not a mistake of nature. It is a variation, one small branch among many that form human biological diversity. The human body is not born from a single mold. It is the result of countless biological experiments over hundreds of thousands of years, where not every outcome is perfect, but many are sufficient to continue. The problem is not albinism. The problem has never been albinism. The problem lies in how society reacts to albinism in the deeply human reflex that appears when faced with a visible difference. When a biological trait is too striking too far outside what the majority calls normal, people rarely stop at accepting it as a natural variation. Instead, they interpret it. They assign meaning. They fill the discomfort of not understanding with a story. And in that moment, biology begins to leave the laboratory and enter the territory of symbols and belief. Skin that is too light stops being just skin. It becomes a sign. It makes eyes linger longer, questions rise faster. It triggers associations far beyond biology, because in human history, skin color has never been only physical. Skin has been tied to power, to status, to the boundary between us and them. When someone appears with skin light enough to feel unusual, society becomes unsettled. It does not know where to place them. It does not know which familiar frame to use. And in that uncertainty, imagination begins to speak. The same is true for eyes sensitive to light. Physiologically, it is simply a consequence of reduced melanin in the eye's structures. But socially, eyes are seen as the window to the soul. A different gaze suggests something different inside. When a person squints under sunlight, avoids direct eye contact because their vision cannot comfortably sustain it, that behavior can be misread. It can be interpreted as avoidance mystery, even suspicion. Physiology is reinterpreted as psychology, and from psychology, society begins to build stories. At this point, science and society move down completely different paths. Science takes the slow, dry road, sometimes even emotionless. It speaks of recessive genes, enzymes that don't function, biochemical pathways interrupted. It does not care whether the explanation feels poetic. It only cares what is true and what can be tested. In the case of albinism, science offers a clear, consistent, non-mystical explanation. But society does not operate that way. Society does not wait for research. It does not require repeated evidence. It does not ask about margin of error or methods. Society moves through emotion, collective memory, and stories passed from one generation to another. When there is no easy explanation, society creates its own. And those explanations often take the shape of myth, belief, stigma, wrapped in moral or spiritual language. For centuries, the social story of albinism has overshadowed the biological story. In many cultures, albino people have not been viewed as a genetic variation, but as a sign of divinity, of omen, of curse, or of something outside the normal order. In some places, they were revered, believed to carry special powers. In other places, they were feared, isolated, even hunted. These extremes may seem opposite, but they share the same root, not understanding. When science has not yet spoken, the empty space of knowledge becomes fertile ground for imagination. And human imagination, when fed by fear and curiosity, can become cruel. An albino child not only has to learn how to live with harsh sunlight, but also how to live with other people's gaze. That gaze is not neutral. It carries questions, judgment, and sometimes danger. Real tragedies have been created not by genes, but by how people interpret genes. And even when science finally offers explanation, the social story does not disappear easily. Myths have their own endurance. Stigma does not dissolve because of one scientific paper. Stories learned in childhood tied to fear and morality often root deeply in collective minds. And so in the modern world, albino people may still face reactions formed in an era when science did not exist. Here we touch a difficult truth that must be said aloud. Much of the suffering experienced by albino people throughout history has not come from their bodies, but from how those bodies are seen, interpreted, and treated. Albinism itself carries no moral meaning. It is simply biological difference. Society is what assigns value, turning difference into symbol, and sometimes turning symbol into justification for exclusion or violence. When we look back at this, we are not only talking about albinism. We are talking about a universal mechanism in human history, how societies respond to difference. Albinism is simply one of the clearest cases because the difference is so visible it cannot be ignored. And because of that, it becomes a mirror reflecting how humans behave when science has not yet replaced fear with understanding. If there is one thing to hold on to from this section, it is this: science does not create tragedy. The absence of science, or the refusal to listen to science, does. When a genetic variation is turned into a symbol, when a biological trait is read as a message from the supernatural, the human being behind that trait becomes easy to erase. And history has shown again and again what happens after that erasure. Unnecessary tragedy begins. This part of the story is meant to clarify something basic. Albino people do not carry supernatural secrets. They are not signs of gods, and they are not curses of nature. They are human beings with bodies that function differently in a few specific ways. And that small difference, once filtered through history and society, has become a story far larger than its biology. In the next part, we will leave the world of genes and enzymes and step into the world of belief and myth, where albinism is no longer seen under the light of science, but through stories passed down for generations. And there we will understand more clearly why a biological phenomenon that is not mystical at all could become the center of fear and misinterpretation across human history. People often hold a very tidy picture of evolution, that it is a perfectly fine-tuned machine, that everything bad will be removed, that anything that still exists today must be useful, optimal, and clearly justified. But biology has never worked that neatly. Evolution is not an ideal architect. It does not design humans from a flawless blueprint. It is closer to a clumsy repairman patching here, stitching there, keeping what is good enough and ignoring what is not yet bad enough to be eliminated immediately. And albinism exists in that gray zone. If we look at it purely through the logic of survival, albinism seems like an obvious disadvantage. Less melanin means the body loses an important layer of protection against ultraviolet radiation. Skin becomes more vulnerable. The risk of skin cancer is higher. Eyes are sensitive to light. Vision is often weaker than average. In a prehistoric world where humans lived under the sun almost all day without effective clothing for protection, without sunglasses, without sunscreen, these factors sound like a sentence. So the question is, why wasn't albinism erased from the human population? To answer that, we have to abandon a common illusion, the illusion that evolution always optimizes. Evolution does not eliminate every mutation. It only eliminates mutations that cause early death before reproductive age, or severely reduce reproduction across the population. Everything else can stay. A mutation can be disadvantageous, but if that disadvantage is not strong enough, if it does not kill the individual before they have children, or does not significantly reduce the number of surviving descendants, then it does not disappear immediately. Albinism fits precisely into this category. Across many historical contexts, people with albinism could still survive into adulthood, still have children, still pass their genes forward. Evolution does not care whether that life is more difficult. Evolution asks only one question: did you leave the next generation behind? If the answer is yes, the gene remains. Another key factor, one that causes many misunderstandings about evolution, is that albinism is often a recessive trait. This sounds like a small, technical detail, but it is actually the key that explains why albinism can persist through human history without being completely eliminated. When a trait is recessive, it does not have to appear frequently in order to be transmitted. Most of the time, it exists in silence, not visible on the outside, not drawing the attention of natural selection. Millions of people can carry an albinism gene without ever knowing it. They are born with typical skin, typical hair, typical eyes. They do not have the characteristic visual challenges. They are not unusually sensitive to light. They do not face any obvious pigment-related biological disadvantage. From an evolutionary point of view, they dissolve completely into the population. There is no external sign for nature to recognize them as different. And because evolution responds only to what is expressed outwardly, what directly affects survival and reproduction, the albinism gene inside them is almost invisible to selection. In carriers who do not express the trait, there is no disadvantage strong enough to reduce their chances of reaching adulthood or having children. They still work, they still adapt, they still form families, they still pass their genome to the next generation. From the standpoint of evolution, there is no reason to touch a gene that causes no clear problem. Evolution does not sweep away every variant simply because it exists. It removes only what is too dangerous to the continuation of a lineage. That is why the albinism gene is like a silent passenger on the long train of human history. It makes no noise. It demands no attention. It does not change the direction of the train. It simply sits there, moving from one generation to the next, faithfully copied each time reproductive cells are formed. In DNA, it remains tightly coiled, preserved, and transmitted, without leaving any trace in the everyday life of the person carrying it. This metaphor matters because it reveals a truth that human intuition often refuses to accept. Evolution does not see what is not expressed. A recessive gene is not spotlit by natural selection until it steps out of the shadows. And that moment stepping out only happens when two recessive copies meet in the same individual. That is a relatively rare event, especially in large populations, where the odds that two people carrying the same recessive gene will meet and have children are not high. But rare does not mean impossible. When two carriers of an albinism gene have a child, that child becomes the place where the recessive gene steps into the light. Only then does albinism appear with its full biological expression. And only then does evolution see the mutation. But even then, the impact is often limited to the individual and family, not strong enough to reshape the entire population. This is why recessive mutations can persist for a very long time, even tens of thousands of years, without being erased. They do not confront natural selection head-on. They slip through the cracks of the system, surviving by not causing too much disruption. And in a world where evolution only needs to be good enough, not perfect, that strategy of silence can be remarkably effective. In small or isolated populations, the role of recessive genes becomes even more visible. When the number of individuals is small, the chance that two people carrying the same recessive gene will meet increases. That can make albinism appear more frequently in certain communities. But even then, the recessive gene does not vanish because it continues to persist inside non-expressing carriers ready to be passed on again. Seen this way, albinism is not a challenge to evolution. It is proof of how evolution actually works. Nature does not cleanse the world by moral standards or aesthetic ideals. It does not eliminate what is ugly or inconvenient the way humans imagine. It responds only to what directly threatens the continuation of a gene line. Everything else, if it is quiet enough, hidden enough, can remain. And it is precisely that quietness that allowed the albinism gene to move through human history, from prehistoric hunter-gatherers through agricultural societies into the modern world. It does not require a noble purpose. It does not need an obvious advantage. It needs only one thing not to be eliminated. In the cold logic of evolution, sometimes that alone is enough for survival. Only in those rare moments when two carriers meet does albinism appear. And because that meeting is not frequent, the negative impact of albinism is not large enough at the population level for evolution to purge it completely. But the story does not end there. Evolution is not only natural selection, it is also random inheritance. In small populations, especially isolated groups, chance can matter as much as survival advantage. This is called genetic drift. If a small group of people carrying the albinism gene happens to survive a major crisis, drought, disease, glaciation, catastrophe, then the frequency of that gene within the survivors can increase unintentionally, not because the gene is good, but because the people who carried it were simply the ones who lived. Human history is full of these knots. Small groups survive disasters, rebuild new communities, and unintentionally carry a genetic set that differs from what existed before. In that case, evolution is not intelligent selection. It is the outcome of luck and loss. There is another misunderstanding that needs to be dismantled: the idea that every biological trait that exists must be beneficial. In reality, many traits in humans today are simply not harmful enough to be removed. Our spine is not perfect for upright walking. Wisdom teeth often cause pain and infection. The human eye has a fixed blind spot. Our airway and Pishavad cross, meaning humans can choke to death. All of these are evidence of a single truth. Evolution does not redesign from the beginning. It repairs on top of what already exists. Albinism is the same. No one chose albinism. It has simply not been dangerous enough to be eliminated entirely. In certain contexts, a lack of melanin is not always an absolute disadvantage. In regions with weak sunlight, especially at high latitudes, lighter skin can help the body synthesize vitamin D more efficiently. Historically, as humans migrated away from the equator, lighter skin gradually became a biological advantage. Albinism is an extreme case of that same trend. It is not optimal, but it lies on the same axis of adaptation. Evolution does not create sharp borders. It creates a spectrum of variation. And albinism sits at the edge of that spectrum. This leads to a conclusion that is deeply important but often ignored because it does not feel dramatic. Albinism does not need to have a special meaning to remain in human history. It does not need to be the trace of a lost civilization. It does not need to be the legacy of gods or non-human beings. It does not need any superpower to justify its existence. It exists because evolution allows things that are imperfect yet survivable to continue alongside time. The problem is that humans do not easily accept randomness. We always search for meaning. We want to believe that everything exists for a noble reason. That difference must come with a mission. When we look at albinism, a difference that is so visible, so striking, so hard to ignore, we are not satisfied with the answer. It's just genetics. We want a bigger story. And when science says evolution isn't perfect, society often replies, it can't be that simple. But here, biological truth becomes deeper than any myth. Evolution does not promise fairness. It does not promise optimization. It promises only continuation. And within that continuation, there is room for vulnerable bodies. There is room for non-ideal variations. There is room for people who must live more slowly under the sun. Albinism reminds us of something important. Humans are not the product of a perfect blueprint, but the result of a long history of patchwork, compromise, and chance. And perhaps what makes albinism difficult for a society to accept is not that it is too different, but that it exposes a truth we do not like to face. That humanity itself is not as perfect as we like to believe. In the next part, we will step out of pure biology to see what history has done to people carrying that imperfection. Not through genes, but through power belief in the stories society has chosen to tell. If evolution explains why albinism wasn't eliminated, then geography and human history helps explain where and how albinism appears. Because albinism is not distributed randomly in the human imagination, yet it follows a very clear logic in population biology. It doesn't belong to a single people. It isn't tied to one fixed land. It doesn't carry the stamp of a separate civilization. Albinism appears on every continent where humans live, but it does not appear at the same frequency everywhere. And it does not appear with the same social reaction everywhere. And that unevenness has produced misunderstandings that have lasted for centuries. If you look at the world map, albinism is a global phenomenon. Africa has people with albinism. Europe has people with albinism. Asia, the Americas, Oceania, no place is completely without it. That fact alone undermines one very common belief, the idea that albinism belongs to a separate human race. If it were a separate group, it would have a clear geographic origin, a migration route we could trace. But that is not what we see. Albinism appears everywhere because recessive genes appear everywhere. The mutations that create albinism genes are not a single one-time event in human history. They can occur multiple times in different populations at different moments in time, and once they appear, they can persist quietly, hidden inside the DNA of carriers who show no outward signs at all. However, what makes the map of albinism truly striking is not that it exists around the world, it is the way it is understood and treated in different places. The same biological mechanism, the same genetic variation, the same reduction of melanin inside cells. Yet as albinism enters different societies, it is assigned completely different meanings. Not because biology changes, but because human beings change the way they tell the story of biology. And it is this difference in storytelling that has created radically different lives for people carrying the very same genetic variation. In some societies, albinism is simply rare. That rarity may invite curiosity, it may draw attention, but it does not automatically trigger fear or worship. In communities with strong access to education and medical knowledge, albinism is typically understood as a genetic condition. People with albinism there may still face real practical challenges, reduced vision skin that is sensitive to sunlight, but they are not automatically burdened with meanings beyond biology. Difference is placed within the framework of healthcare and support, not within the framework of judgment or myth. In these places, albinism is a rare trait, not a label meant to define an entire human being. But in other societies where scientific knowledge is not widespread, or where science is not broadly trusted, rarity quickly transforms into abnormal. And abnormal is no longer only a statistical difference. It becomes a social category. A person with albinism is not seen as a rare individual, but as an exception that does not fit the familiar order. When a society relies on clear templates of appearance, skin tone resemblance, sameness, anyone who falls outside that template becomes a question. And when people face a question they do not have scientific tools to answer, they tend to fill the gap with speculation. That speculation is rarely neutral. It carries emotion, and the strongest emotion in these cases is often unease. A body that looks unusual can make a community feel that order has been disturbed. If most people look the same, then the person who does not look like the majority becomes an unspoken reminder that the order is not absolute. And in many cultures where stability and repetition are treated as the foundation of safety, anything that breaks the familiar pattern is watched with caution. At that level, a person with albinism is no longer merely rare. They become different, and once someone has been framed as different, society begins searching for the reason. Not a biological reason, but a moral reason, a spiritual reason, a mysterious reason. Difference is read as a message. The question stops being, what happened in the genes, and becomes, what does this mean? And that shift in the question is exactly what opens the door to myth. And in a few places where spiritual belief occupies the center of community life, people with albinism are pushed even farther from unusual into supernatural. Here, albinism is no longer treated as a biological variation, but as a sign from another world. In some places, they are seen as chosen as having special power, as able to connect with gods or invisible forces. In other places, they are read as omens, as signals of misfortune, of imbalance, of a rupture in cosmic order. Whether they are worshipped or feared, both reactions share the same foundation. People with albinism are no longer seen as ordinary human beings. When someone is pushed into the category of the supernatural, they lose the right to exist simply as an individual. They become a symbol, a tool for a community to interpret its own hidden anxieties. In some cases, being sanctified may offer a surface-level protection, but it also removes the right to private life. In other cases, fear becomes exclusion violence and tragedy that repeats across generations. And none of this originates in melanin or enzymes or DNA. It originates in the way human beings handle rarity. What's important to notice is that the boundary between rare, abnormal, and supernatural is not fixed. It depends on history, on social structure, on how anxious a community is when faced with what it cannot control. The same biological phenomenon in a stable society may remain a statistic. In a society under pressure, war, illness, poverty, it can become a container for collective fear. When a community needs an explanation for uncertainty, what is rare and visibly striking often gets pulled into the center of the story. So, the map of albinism is not only a map of genes and geography, it is a map of human perception. It shows where societies have enough tools to treat difference as part of nature, and where societies lean on myth in order to soothe themselves. It reveals the truth that biology is universal, but human reaction is not. And within that unevenness, the lives of people with albinism have been shaped, not by their DNA, but by the story society chooses to tell about that DNA. When we look back, we can see that albinism itself does not change from continent to continent. What changes is the gaze. And that gaze, not the genetic mutation, often determines whether a person gets to live as a normal individual or is forced into the role of a symbol they never chose. Africa is the clearest and the most painful example of how an ordinary biological difference can be pushed into a severe social crisis simply because of how it is seen. If we look purely at biology, albinism in Africa is not rare in an unnatural way. On the global scale, the prevalence of albinism is often estimated at roughly 1 in 17,000 to 1 in 20,000 people. In many regions of sub-Saharan Africa, epidemiological research suggests a higher prevalence than the global average, but not in a way that is outside evolution or beyond natural rules. In some East African countries, especially Tanzania, the prevalence of albinism has been reported around 1 in 1,400 to 1 in 1,500 people, one of the highest rates in the world. In Burundi, estimates are also around 1 in 1,400. In Kenya, Uganda, Malawi, and parts of Nigeria, figures are often reported in the range of about 1 in 3,000 to 1 in 5,000. Across the continent, international health organizations estimate that Africa may have more than 400,000 people with albinism, a significant share of the global population of people with albinism. These numbers point to something essential. Albinism is not an alien phenomenon in Africa. It is not the result of different blood. It is not evidence of a supernatural origin. It is simply a genetic variation, appearing more frequently due to population history, including relatively closed communities, marriage within narrower geographic areas, and the amplification of recessive genes across generations. Scientifically, there is nothing mystical here. But the problem is not biology. The problem is the social gaze. In environments where most people have darker skin, where abundant melanin is the familiar baseline, a child born with very light skin immediately breaks the shared visual pattern. The contrast is not only visible, it is almost impossible to ignore. Light skin does not blend into the crowd. It separates, stands out, and forces the gaze to stop. Unlike societies with a broad spectrum of skin tones where lighter skin is simply one point on a wide continuum, many traditional African communities experience the difference in a more binary way. Either you resemble the majority or you do not. And when a difference falls into the category of not resembling, it is quickly pushed out of biology and into social interpretation. A child with albinism in Africa often has no opportunity to hide within the majority. From birth, their body becomes a visual statement. Without saying a word, without doing anything at all, difference speaks first. In societies where knowledge of genetics is limited, this sharp, obvious contrast is difficult to explain, with concepts like enzymes and recessive genes. And when scientific language is missing, people return to older language, the language of belief. A contrast that strong makes biological difference impossible to ignore. And when something cannot be ignored, society tends to assign it meaning. That is the most dangerous moment, because the meaning is not built from data. It is built from fear, unease, and the desire to control what cannot be understood. That is why in many regions of Africa, people with albinism are not viewed as merely rare, but as not belonging to the familiar natural order. Some communities connect them to the spirit world. Others link them to curses, omens, or imbalance within family and community. These interpretations do not come from innate cruelty. They come from a human attempt to create meaningful order when science is absent. The irony is this: the place where albinism is most visually noticeable is often the place where people with albinism are most socially vulnerable. Not because there are more of them, but because they stand out more. Not because their genes are different, but because the context makes their difference impossible to dissolve into the crowd. Africa in this story is not a biological exception. It is a magnifying mirror. It shows what happens when a normal genetic variation meets a society that does not yet have the tools to explain it. And through that mirror, we see a clear truth. The issue of albinism has never been about the numbers, the rates, or the genes. It has always been about the gaze, the story, and the way society treats what is too different to ignore. And when a difference cannot be ignored in a society with limited access to genetic knowledge, it can easily be interpreted through the language of belief. In some communities, albinism becomes linked to misfortune. In others, it becomes linked to power. Both interpretations come from the same root. Albinism is pulled out of biology and placed into the world of symbols. Not because it is dangerous, but because it is so different. In Europe, albinism often produces less dramatic visual contrast. Light skin is already common in many regions. Light hair and light eyes are not unusual, so historically, people with albinism in Europe were less likely to be seen as non-human and more likely to be seen as simply unusual. They could still be stared at, still be treated as a curiosity, but were less often pushed into extreme mythologies. When a biological difference is not overwhelmingly striking to the eye, social interpretation tends to soften. This reveals an important truth. The map of albinism is not only a map of genes, it is a map of the social gaze. In Asia, albinism exists at slightly lower rates in many areas, but it does not disappear. In East Asian societies where lighter skin has historically been tied to social status and to the idea of indoor labor, people with albinism are not always treated as frightening, but they are still easily misunderstood. They may be assumed to be frail, chronically ill, or to have a special constitution. Once again, this is not biology speaking, it is social templates speaking. In the Americas, especially within indigenous communities before modern times, albinism was often interpreted through spirituality. Some groups saw a person with albinism as a sign from the spirit world. Some saw a messenger. Some saw an omen. Not because albinism carries special meaning, but because human beings everywhere tend to assign meaning to what is rare. Rarity draws attention. Attention produces story. But if we remove cultural interpretation and look only through population biology, the map of albinism tells a very different story. It is a story of human migration, small, isolated populations, population bottlenecks, and recessive genes, moving through history unnoticed. In small communities, the odds that two carriers of the same recessive gene will meet are higher. In large populations, the gene disperses and is less often expressed. That is why some regions show higher than average rates without needing any special explanation. Not because the land is unusual, but because its population history is. The most important thing the map of albinism shows us is not rarity, but universality. Albinism is not a fringe phenomenon of humanity. It is part of normal human biological diversity. Only the way societies react to it becomes abnormal. In one place, people with albinism are revered. In another, they are excluded. In another, they are simply a rare individual. But everywhere the biological mechanism remains the same kind of mutation, the same genetic logic, the same quiet presence of a recessive gene. The map of albinism, if you stare at it long enough, forces us to admit something simple. There is no land of albinism. There are only lands where societies choose to tell different stories about the same biological phenomenon. And when a story is told for long enough, it can obscure the real map. In the next part, we won't look at albinism through geography, but through the map of belief and power, where rarity does not only create curiosity, but also fear sanctification and the heaviest consequences for people who simply carry a genetic variation, moving through history alongside the rest of humanity. Before science had words for genes, enzymes, or genetic mutations, people still had to live alongside difference using a different language. The language of myth. Not because humans wanted to distort the truth, but because they needed a way to understand the world when the tools for explanation did not yet exist. In that era, the question why didn't have a laboratory to answer it. It had a hearth, a listening circle, and a shared memory carried forward through spoken stories. In pre-scientific societies, anything rare carried a special weight. Rare didn't only mean uncommon, it meant a break in the familiar rhythm of life. The less something appeared, the more it made people stop, stare, and wonder. And in a world where natural disasters, illness, hunger, and death could arrive at any time, every unanswered question created unease. Rare meant noticeable. Noticeable meant it demanded an explanation. Not because people were purely curious, but because they needed to feel that the world around them still had order, still had some kind of logic, even if that logic was not necessarily correct. When biological knowledge didn't exist, people had no concept of genes, enzymes, mutation, or genetic probability. The real causes of difference were beyond their sight and beyond their language. But human beings cannot live with a vacuum of meaning for very long. An unexplained phenomenon slowly becomes a psychological threat. So they turned to what they already had lived experience accumulated across generations, religious belief that soothed fear and imagination, the most powerful tool for stitching scattered pieces into a story that feels coherent. In that context, myth was not the product of ignorance or deliberate deception. It was a mechanism of spiritual survival. When people could not control the world through action, they tried to control it through meaning. Myth allowed them to believe that what happened was not completely random, that behind every unusual event there was a cause, even if that cause was a god, an ancestral spirit, or an invisible rule known only to the community. Believing a story, even a wrong one, can sometimes feel easier than accepting that the world may operate coldly without any concern for human emotions. Albinism entered human history in exactly that context, not as a medical term, but as a phenomenon that directly disrupted visual perception and the community's familiar sense of order. A child born with skin too light in an environment where most people were dark-skinned, hair too pale among black hair, eyes that reacted differently to light, often squinting, turning away, or looking in a way that didn't match other children. None of this needed scientific explanation in order to register as different. It was already enough to provoke questions. But those questions could not be answered with invisible concepts. No one could see genes. No one could observe enzymes. No one understood that inside cells a delicate biochemical chain reaction was unfolding. The community only saw the final result, a body that did not resemble the majority. And in a pre-scientific world, what cannot be seen is difficult to accept as a cause. A cause had to have form. It had to have a story. It had to be something you could tell by the fire and pass down to the next generation. So when people could not name it through science, they named it through symbol. Light skin became a sign of sacred light, or of light's absence. Sensitive eyes became the ability to see another world, or proof of imperfection. An unusual body became a message, not a message from biology, but a message from the cosmic order as people imagined it. The child was no longer just a newborn individual. The child became a living question, a moving symbol the community had to assign meaning to in order to feel safe. In that process, myth was not created in a single moment. It formed slowly through repeated retellings, each time adding a detail, a connection, a personal experience. A story that began as an explanation could gradually harden into a fixed belief. And when that belief is carried from one generation to the next, it no longer needs evidence. It becomes how it has always been. Albinism then entered human history not only as a biological variation, but as a blank white cloth onto which societies painted their fears, hopes, and anxieties. Those stories said very little about melanin or inheritance, but they revealed a great deal about how human beings respond when faced with difference they do not yet have the tools to understand. And in the space between what can be seen and what cannot be explained, myth found a firm, lasting place, sometimes with heavy consequences. Myth often begins very simply. A question is asked. Where did this come from? Then an answer takes shape built out of whatever feels most familiar. If a community believes in gods, the answer will carry the color of gods. If it believes in ancestral spirits, the answer will move in that direction. If the community is under pressure from disaster, illness, or hunger, the answer can easily absorb fear and search for causes in what looks unusual. From there, albinism stops being a biological variation. It becomes a message, a sign, a reminder that the familiar order can be broken. In many cultures, people believe the world runs on a fragile balance. When something too different appears, that balance feels threatened. And to restore a sense of safety, the community needs a story even if the story is not biologically true. In some places, myth did not push people with albinism to the margins. Instead, it pulled them too high, so high, they could no longer stand on the same ground as everyone else. In those societies, difference was not treated as a deviation, but interpreted as a mark of selection. People with albinism were assigned a role between humans and gods, between the visible world and the invisible one. Light skin was no longer simply biology. It became a symbol of sacred light. Pale hair was told as a trace of another realm. Eyes sensitive to sunlight were interpreted as the ability to see through layers of reality ordinary people could not touch. In those stories, people with albinism were not expelled. They were respected, sometimes even feared, but in a reverent way. Yet that respect did not bring freedom. It brought obligation. They were no longer permitted to simply be themselves. Every action, every personal choice was examined through the lens of symbol. If they were silent, it was no longer the silence of a person. It was a sign. If they spoke, their words no longer belonged to them. They were interpreted as messages from somewhere else. They were forced to carry meaning, even when they never asked to. Living inside that role is a psychological burden. In such societies, a person with albinism is often not allowed to fail the way others can. A small mistake can be read as betrayal of a sacred function. An ordinary decision, loving someone leaving the community, choosing a private life, can be treated as a threat to the symbolic order the society has built around them. They are lifted up, but also boxed in more tightly than almost anyone else. Praise becomes an invisible cage where a human being is turned into a symbol and loses the right to be ordinary. In other places, myth took the opposite path, darker, harsher. Their difference was not sanctified, it was treated as danger. Light skin was no longer light, it became a sign of deviation. Sensitive eyes were no longer a special ability, they were proof of imperfection. People with albinism were positioned as bad omens, warnings, evidence that something had gone wrong from the very moment of birth. In these communities, myth did not remain at the level of storytelling. It slid from story into belief, from belief into rule, and from rule into concrete behavior. A child with albinism was not just different. The child was treated as evidence that something had gone wrong in the moral order of a family or a community. Their birth could be blamed on parental wrongdoing, taboo breaking, or interference from the spirit world in a dangerous form. And once the cause is assigned to invisible forces, it becomes nearly impossible to challenge. In that environment, fear stops being a private emotion and becomes collective. It spreads from one person to another, strengthened through repeated stories, rituals, and warnings about disasters that supposedly happened because people didn't handle it properly. Exclusion stops looking like cruelty and begins to look like necessity. Harm, when it occurs, is no longer seen as individual wrongdoing. It is justified through moral and spiritual language. The person who causes harm may not see themselves as evil. They believe they are doing what is right, preserving order, preventing an invisible catastrophe. The most terrifying part of such myths is not their content, but what they make possible. They allow people to stop seeing a person as a person. When an individual is turned into a symbol, whether a sacred symbol or a dangerous one, they are no longer treated as a full human being with feelings, fear, and the right to safety. They become a tool for society to manage its own anxieties. And in both extremes, worship or exclusion, people with albinism pay the same deepest price, the loss of the right to exist as an ordinary individual without carrying meanings they never chose. The common thread in both extremes, reverence and fear, is the absence of science. When science has no voice, myth does more than fill gaps in knowledge. It shapes social law. It decides who is protected, who is suspected, who is granted power, and who is stripped of it. And because myth is passed through speech, it has remarkable endurance. Each retelling adjusts to the present, but the core meaning remains. In agricultural societies where human life is tied to seasons and weather, anything unusual is easily linked to collective fate. A failed harvest demands an explanation. An outbreak of illness needs a cause. In those moments, the most visibly striking differences, bodies that do not match the majority, can become anchors for the story. Not because they cause disaster, but because they appear at the exact moment fear is searching for a shape. Myth also protects itself. When challenged, it does not vanish. It adapts. If someone questions it, the community answers with tradition. If someone doubts it, the response is often, "It has always been this way." Repetition produces the feeling of truth. And once a story has been repeated long enough, it no longer needs evidence. It becomes common knowledge. That is why even when science begins to appear, its voice does not immediately replace myth. The two can coexist for a long time. Science speaks in data. Myth speaks in emotion. Science needs time to spread. Myth has been there since childhood. And in everyday life, myth often wins. For people with albinism, the consequences of the era before science had a voice are not just incorrect stories. They shape the way people are seen, treated, and placed inside their communities. A child growing up inside myth does not only learn how to avoid the harsh sun, they learn how to avoid the gaze. They do not only learn how to protect their skin, they learn how to protect themselves from questions and assumptions they cannot control. There is a deep paradox here. Myth by nature is a tool for finding meaning. But when imposed on real human beings, it can strip away their personal meaning. A person with albinism becomes a symbol before they are recognized as a person. And when the symbol overwhelms the person, every decision made about them, from protection to exclusion, can be justified. This part of the story is not meant to condemn the past using the standards of the present. It is meant to reveal a repeating mechanism in human history. When knowledge is insufficient, people tell stories. When fear is larger than understanding, stories become extreme. And when stories are given authority, those who fall outside the norm become their targets. Albinism in the era when science had no voice is a clear mirror of that mechanism. It shows how a normal biological phenomenon can be pulled out of nature and placed into morality, spirituality, or the supernatural. It shows that the problem is not difference itself, but the way society handles difference when it lacks the tools to understand. In the next part, as science begins to speak slowly, imperfectly, we will see what changes, what does not, and why. Even when the correct explanation exists, the older stories do not disappear easily. Because once myth steps in, it does not leave simply because truth arrives. Africa is not the place where albinism occurs the most in purely biological terms. But it is the place where albinism is seen the most in social terms. Medically, the prevalence of albinism across Africa is generally comparable to, or only slightly higher than, many other regions of the world. The World Health Organization estimates that on average, about 1 in 17,000 to 20,000 people has albinism. However, in some East African countries, such as Tanzania or Malawi, the rate is significantly higher, ranging from roughly 1 in 1,400 to 1 in 5,000, depending on the area. In populations of tens of millions, that means tens of thousands of people with albinism are living inside communities where the vast majority of residents have dark skin. Here, the biological difference becomes impossible to hide. In societies where skin tone is relatively uniform, albinism can be recognized from the very first moment. A newborn with very light skin, white or pale blonde hair, and eyes that are sensitive to light does not need any test to be labeled different. That stark visual contrast turns albinism into more than a medical condition. It becomes a social phenomenon. And when a society does not have enough scientific tools or shared scientific language to explain what people are seeing, myth moves in quickly to fill the gap. In many communities in sub-Saharan Africa, albinism is surrounded by a dense, overlapping web of folk beliefs. In some places, people believe that a person with albinism is not fully human, but a spirit and omen, or the result of supernatural interference. In other places, there are beliefs that they cannot die normally, that they vanish at death, or that they carry invisible power. These beliefs are not always spoken aloud in public, but they quietly shape how communities perceive and treat people with albinism. In the context of prolonged poverty, where many communities live in a constant state of vulnerability, the myths surrounding albinism do not remain at the level of symbol or explanation. When daily life is dominated by scarcity, illness, unemployment, and the constant risk of survival, belief can slip into a different form, belief that promises benefit. What begins as unusual can gradually be reframed as useful. People with albinism, instead of being seen only as different, can begin to be viewed as a kind of resource within a system of superstition that operates alongside ordinary life. Some witch doctors and brokers of folk belief spread the idea that the bodies of people with albinism hold special value, that parts of their bodies can be used in rituals meant to attract luck, wealth protection from danger or advantage in business and local politics. In these stories, a person is no longer seen as a living individual. Their humanity is separated from them and converted into symbolic materials. The value of a life is distorted, measured by false belief rather than by human dignity. From here, the tragedy enters a different phase, colder, more systematic, and far more dangerous. It is no longer only quiet exclusion or everyday stigma. This is where targeted harm begins, people being watched, hunted, and stripped of the most basic form of safety simply because they carry a rare biological trait. Reports from the United Nations and many international human rights organizations have documented that over more than 2 decades in certain parts of East and Southern Africa, there have been hundreds of cases in which people with albinism were killed or suffered severe bodily harm linked to superstitious beliefs. These acts are not random. They are often connected to shadow networks, where distorted belief is turned into a motive for profit. Most alarming is the fact that many victims belong to the most vulnerable groups in society, those who cannot easily protect themselves, those who depend on the safety of family and community. In some heartbreaking cases, the silence of the surrounding environment, or the fear that prevents people from speaking, has allowed violence to continue without timely intervention. The consequences do not live only in statistics. They create a long, enduring atmosphere of fear. Families with a member who has albinism live in constant vigilance. Children grow up with the sense that their own bodies are a risk, not because they did anything wrong, but because of what society has chosen to believe about difference. The most dangerous element is not albinism itself. It is the way myth is used to justify behavior. When a false belief is repeated long enough, it can harden into a warped moral reference point, one in which acts of harm are narrated as necessary, reasonable, or for the common good. And when the boundary between a person and a symbol is erased, violence is no longer seen as something to stop, but as something inevitable. This tragedy reveals a cold truth. when scientific knowledge does not spread, far enough myth will fill the empty space. And when myth combines with poverty, instability, and weak legal protection, it does not only generate false stories, it generates fear, it generates a market for distorted belief, and it pushes innocent people simply because they carry a genetic variation into prolonged danger, even in the modern world. These attacks rarely happen in broad daylight. They unfold at night in remote rural areas where the presence of law is thin. Some families wake up to discover their child has vanished. Some people are attacked on their way to school, or work, or while sleeping at home. At times, someone familiar within the community is the one who points the victim out. That betrayal is not driven by personal hatred so much as by the belief that an unusual body can bring greater benefit than that person's life itself. The harm does not end with the number of deaths or injuries. An entire generation of people with albinism is forced to live in constant alertness. Many families are compelled to hide their children at home, keeping them from school, keeping them from going outside. Children grow up in fear, learning to avoid people's gaze, not only because of sunlight, but because of the danger that can come from other human beings. Some countries have created shelters or boarding schools specifically for children with albinism spaces that are protective, but also reveal a social failure when children must be separated from their own communities simply to survive. The irony is that alongside violence, people with albinism in Africa also face severe medical challenges. The lack of melanin makes them especially vulnerable to skin cancer under harsh tropical sun. Yet sunscreen, protective eyewear, and basic skincare are luxury items for many poor families. Many people with albinism die of skin cancer at a very young age, not because the disease is rare, but because the simplest protective measures, which are taken for granted elsewhere, are not accessible. Under growing pressure from the international community, global media, and human rights organizations, some African governments have been forced to begin taking action. Not because albinism suddenly appeared, but because the issue finally crossed the boundary of being treated as internal, becoming a global human concern. When heartbreaking stories were documented, when official reports were published, and when the outside world began asking questions, silence was no longer a safe option. In some countries, laws have been revised or strengthened. Acts of violence targeting people with albinism have been more clearly defined within legal systems, no longer dismissed as cultural matters or private disputes. Some individuals who exploited superstitious belief for profit have been prosecuted, sending a message that the state will no longer look away from severe harm. Even if enforcement has not matched the scale of the problem, these steps are still symbolically significant. People with albinism are no longer treated as outside the law's protection. Alongside that, community education campaigns have been launched, often with the support of international NGOs. Talks in villages, schools, and health centers try to explain something that sounds simple, yet can be extraordinarily difficult in practice. Albinism is a genetic condition. It is not a sign of magic, not an omen, not the result of moral wrongdoing or supernatural intervention. It is simply a biological variation, like thousands of other variations that exist in human bodies. At the global level, the United Nations has formally brought attention to this issue on the international stage. The appointment of special rapporteurs on the human rights situation of persons with albinism is not only an act of monitoring, it is an acknowledgement that this is a serious human rights matter requiring long-term attention. Reports are presented before global assemblies, international awareness days are established, and policy recommendations are delivered to member states. Albinism, once treated as something unspeakable, has been given a clear name within the language of international law and human rights. And yet all of these efforts confront a stubborn reality. Laws can be written quickly, but belief cannot. Myths that have lived for centuries do not disappear because a legal document exists. Belief is not maintained by logic alone. It is sustained by emotion, fear, and collective memory. In communities where life remains fragile, where science has not become the everyday tool for interpreting reality, myth continues to have its own life, sometimes stronger than the voice of government. That is why the tragedy of albinism in Africa is not a tragedy of biology. There is nothing wrong in the gene. There is no deviation in nature. The tragedy is that a neutral biological variation is pulled into an unstable social environment where poverty, limited scientific education, and belief systems, not yet replaced by knowledge, coexist and reinforce each other. In that environment, difference is not understood as a normal part of human diversity. It is interpreted as a sign, an omen, or a source of illegitimate benefit. This story exposes a hard truth we have to face. The same genetic variation in one place is simply rare a medical trait that requires care and support. But somewhere else, it can become a reason for a person to be pushed into prolonged danger. Not because bodies are different, but because societies tell different stories about bodies. Genes do not create violence on their own. Myths do not exist by themselves. It is human choice what we choose to believe, what we choose to repeat, and what we choose to do that determines the outcome. And because of that, a long-term solution cannot come only from police or courtrooms. It must come from education, from healthcare, from building trust in science as a more reliable tool for understanding the world than myth. It requires time, patience, and a sustained commitment to the principle that every human being, whatever their biological variation, deserves to be seen first as human, not as a symbol of fear or of distorted hope. And here, the story of albinism forces humanity to face an even larger question when science already has the explanation, but society is not ready to listen. Who carries responsibility? Albinism in Africa is not only an issue of one continent. It is a mirror reflecting how human beings anywhere can turn difference into violence when knowledge is absent. Compassion is weak, and systems meant to protect the vulnerable are not strong enough. When science hasn't yet had the time to fill the gaps in what we know, and when myth has already taken root in the way people see the world, rare differences often don't remain simply different. They get pushed farther out, magnified, dressed in meanings that go beyond reality. And at some point, the difference starts to be called by a more alluring name, a superpower. For people with albinism, that process can feel almost inevitable. A body that is visibly different, skin that stands out as unusually light, a reaction to light that doesn't match the majority, certain physiological traits that require special adaptation. All of these elements, once placed inside cultural expectations and collective psychology, can be easily interpreted as signs of something more than human, beyond human, or outside the ordinary order of things. In many societies, especially in the modern world, where traditional belief systems haven't disappeared so much as changed their shape, these misinterpretations of albinism haven't faded away. They are no longer told around a fire or embedded only in ancient rituals. Instead, they appear on phone screens, in posts that spread at lightning speed, in short videos labeled fun facts or things you didn't know. Myth no longer wears purely religious clothing. It has learned to speak the language of the digital age. Stories that once linked people with albinism to gods, spirits, or omens are now rebuilt using terms that sound more scientific, or at least more modern. Instead of chosen by heaven, they are described as having stronger intuition. Instead of seeing another world, they are said to be sensitive to energy. Instead of marked by the supernatural, they are associated with exceptional intelligence, unusual creativity, or a deeper awareness of emotions and the environment. The vocabulary has changed, but the core logic has not a biological difference, is still being interpreted as evidence of something beyond ordinary humanity. What's distinctive about these modern myths is that they are rarely presented as blind faith. They're often wrapped in statements that sound reasonable. Maybe science hasn't proven it yet, but everyone I know with albinism is so sensitive. It can't be random that they're rare. These claims use science's own caution as a doorway for speculation. When science says there isn't evidence, myth quickly steps in to say, so it could be true. Unlike the openly negative prejudices of the past, many contemporary superpower stories about people with albinism are told in a tone of admiration. They appear positive, sometimes even compassionate. They allow the storyteller to feel as though they're celebrating diversity, as though they're finding beauty in difference. But precisely because the tone is positive, these interpretations are harder to challenge. Very few people want to push back against a story told with good intentions, even when that story still places an entire group of people into the role of an exception. Media and social platforms amplify this process. Algorithms reward content that sparks curiosity, that creates the thrill of discovering a secret, which makes stories about albinism and special abilities far more likely to spread than dry explanations of biology. A personal experience can quickly be elevated into a pattern. A handful of memorable cases repeated often enough can create the illusion of a rule. In that environment, the boundary between individual experience and general conclusion gets blurred. It's also worth noticing that these newer myths are often told more by people outside the albinism community than by those living it. They reflect the majority's desire to see difference as something fascinating Shenji magical, rather than as a reality that demands understanding and support. Assigning special qualities to people with albinism allows society to feel as though it has accepted difference, while quietly avoiding harder questions about access to healthcare education and social safety. And because these stories are told in an admiring tone, they're rarely recognized as a form of bias. They don't openly harm, they don't directly exclude, but they still shape expectations in subtle ways. They can make ordinary humanity feel not enough. If a person with albinism isn't unusually intuitive, unusually creative, unusually special in the way society imagines, they may be seen as failing to match the myth that's been built around them. So, from ancient mythology to modern misinterpretations, the red thread remains the same: society keeps trying to assign oversized meaning to rare difference. Whether fueled by fear or by admiration, these narratives often say more about the psychological needs of the storyteller than they do about the lived reality of people with albinism. And it is within that confusion between celebration and genuine understanding that distorted interpretations continue to survive, adapt, and spread in the modern world. But right here, a subtle distortion appears. When difference is labeled a superpower, people think they are lifting someone up. In reality, they are still separating that person from ordinary human dignity. Instead of seeing people with albinism as individuals with strengths, weaknesses, needs, and limits like anyone else, society places them into a new mold, a mold of forced specialness. In many communities, especially online, lists of traits of people with albinism circulate: more emotionally sensitive, smarter than average, exceptionally creative, more open to spiritual experiences. These lists are usually built from personal anecdotes, from hearsay, or from selective examples chosen to fit an existing belief. They rarely rest on rigorous scientific research, but repeated often enough, they begin to feel like an unspoken truth. From a psychological point of view, this isn't difficult to understand. Human beings look for meaning in difference, especially when they or someone they love carries that difference. When someone grows up feeling not like everyone else, when the world around them constantly reminds them that they stand out searching for a positive explanation, becomes natural. I'm different because I'm special is far easier to live with than I'm different because of genetic probability. Here, the idea of superpower can function as a form of emotional self-protection. It helps someone transform what once caused pain into a source of pride. It helps them tell their own story in a way that hurts less, and on an individual level that isn't always harmful. The problem begins when an individual coping story becomes a social definition, when it is generalized outward and used to label an entire group. Science, however, tells a different story. So far, there is no reliable scientific evidence showing that albinism is systematically linked to superior intelligence perception or extraordinary intuitive abilities. Albinism is a genetic condition affecting melanin production. Its main biological effects relate to the skin, the eyes, and the body's protection against light. Any differences in personality, intelligence, or emotional style are influenced by many other factors: environment, education, personal experience, and genetic variables unrelated to melanin. But science often speaks in a language that feels cold. It doesn't offer mystery. It doesn't hand people a vivid story to hold on to. And so, in the quiet competition between science and myth, superpower narratives tend to spread more easily. They are appealing. They are simple. They allow people to believe that rare difference must always come with some grand meaning. The danger is that even positive myths can create invisible pressure. When a person with albinism is expected to be more sensitive, more intelligent, more intuitive, they may feel like they've failed if they don't match that image. They face not only negative stigma, but unrealistic expectations. They are no longer allowed to be weak, no longer allowed to be ordinary. Any personal limitation risks being read as not living up to their special potential. In some contexts, especially within certain modern spiritual trends, albinism is even tied to stories about ancient bloodlines, ancestral memory, or a special role in humanity's transition. These interpretations often use pseudoscientific language, mixing genetic terminology with vague concepts of energy and the universe. They can sound like knowledge, but they do not follow any method of verification. What's worrying is that when these stories are believed, they can lead people to ignore real medical needs or to replace scientific care with an abstract faith. Once again, the problem is not that people tell stories. Storytelling is one of the oldest human instincts. Before writing, before science, even before people understood cause and effect, we used stories to organize reality, pass down experience, ease fear, and find meaning in what we could not control. Stories help people feel less alone inside a universe that is vast and often indifferent to individual fate. So, the act of storytelling itself is not the mistake. The mistake begins when story replaces reality, when symbol overpowers the real human being standing behind the symbol. When the superpower narrative becomes so seductive that it hides a very simple truth: people with albinism are first and foremost human beings. They have bodies that need appropriate medical care. They have needs that involve very concrete protections. They have feelings, dreams, limits, and the right to live safely just like anyone else. When difference is inflated into something supernatural, society quietly shifts its focus. Instead of asking, how can they be safer, the question becomes, what's special about them? Instead of investing attention in education, healthcare and legal protection attention flows toward curiosity-driven stories. And in that shift, the most practical needs get pushed to the margins. A person with albinism may need sunscreen protective eyewear and a learning environment that accommodates visual limitations. But the superpower story can make those needs seem ordinary, shenja easy to dismiss. More dangerously, once difference is mythologized, it becomes easier to exploit. Anything labeled supernatural value can be turned into a tool. Stories about intuition energy or unusual abilities can be used to attract attention, to make money, or to manipulate belief. In that setting, a person with albinism is no longer the author of their own story. They become raw material for someone else's narrative. This inflation can also open the door to justifying unhealthy behavior. When a group is framed as different in a supernatural sense, society becomes more willing to accept abnormal ways of treating them. Limits placed on personal life can be narrated as because of their special role. Control can be disguised as protection. And in extreme cases, harm can be rationalized as the natural outcome of distorted beliefs that have been socially validated by myth. Even when it doesn't lead to physical harm, the superpower narrative can still create deep emotional damage. It places expectations on people with albinism that they never chose. They are not only navigating a biological difference, they are carrying the additional burden of embodying an ideal image that society invented. If they do not match that image, they may be met with disappointment, suspicion, or the suggestion that they haven't unlocked their full potential. The right to be ordinary, the right not to be special, becomes a luxury. The central point is this: real respect doesn't come from mythologizing. It comes from seeing the full humanity of a person. A mature society does not need to attach supernatural meaning to difference in order to accept it. In fact, the ability to accept that not everything has a grand purpose can be a sign of deeper understanding. History shows that assigning special powers to a rare group rarely ends well. It may begin with curiosity or admiration, but it can slide into control expectation and eventually exclusion. When society refuses to let a group exist as ordinary individuals, whether through worship or fear, their freedom is restricted either way. That's why the most accurate way to understand albinism is not to deny difference and not to mythologize it. It is to return difference to its real place, a biological variation within the human spectrum. Not prophecy, not a supernatural marker, not a superpower to be unlocked. Simply part of the complex story of evolution, where randomness and probability play a far larger role than human beings usually want to admit. Seen that way, people with albinism do not have to carry strange expectations in order to deserve respect. They do not have to be extraordinary in order to deserve protection. They do not need a superpower in order to have the right to safety, education, and love. And perhaps that is the most important step a society can take to move away from myth and toward a more grounded human and compassionate understanding of difference. There is a very quiet truth that runs through the lives of many people. With albinism, the world they enter from the moment they are born was not designed with them in mind, not out of malice, not out of an intention to exclude, but out of an invisible default assumption that a normal person has a certain kind of body, a certain way of processing light, a certain level of tolerance, and that anyone outside that template must learn on their own how to adapt. That mismatch begins with the smallest things, so small they are often overlooked. Sunlight, a symbol of life, of daily social rhythm, of everything that happens outdoors, is, for many people with albinism, something that must be weighed and planned around day after day. When melanin isn't available in sufficient amounts to act as a natural layer of protection, light is not simply bright. It becomes harsh, glaring, and quickly exhausting. The eyes have to work harder to adjust. The skin faces greater risk under the same intensity of sun that others experience as normal. This difference rarely produces a dramatic moment, but it quietly shapes the way a person plans an entire day of living. Spaces designed to be bright enough for the majority, as a result, become too much for a small minority. Fluorescent lights in a classroom, strong white lighting in an office, roads without shade, playgrounds flooded with sun. All of it operates on an unstated assumption that every pair of eyes can tolerate roughly the same conditions, that human vision is a single uniform standard. When that assumption fails, the problem is not the individual body. The problem is the way space has been designed. In school, this mismatch shows itself clearly, and it often leaves long-term consequences. Children with albinism may struggle to see the board from a distance, read small print in textbooks, or sustain focus for long periods under intense lighting. These difficulties don't always present like an obvious medical issue. They don't force a child to suddenly miss class. They don't cause immediate visible pain. They simply make learning more tiring, slower, and more energy-consuming. And precisely because that struggle is not dramatic, their specific needs are easy to miss. When a child can't keep up with a lesson, the system's reflex is often to look for the cause in attitude or ability not paying attention. Not trying hard enough. Being lazy. These labels are applied almost unconsciously, not because teachers lack goodwill, but because they're working inside a system that is rarely equipped to recognize forms of difference that aren't common. Albinism is not something most teacher training programs address in a concrete way. And what is not taught is difficult to notice. The result is that instead of receiving simple support sitting closer to the board, larger print materials adjusted lighting children with albinism may be forced to manage in silence. Constantly straining their eyes and trying to focus in unsuitable conditions increases mental fatigue. Over time, that fatigue can be mistaken for a lack of motivation. A loop forms difficulty leads to exhaustion. Exhaustion leads to lower performance. Lower performance leads to negative evaluation. What's important is that in many cases, early recognition alone is enough to change that trajectory. When teachers understand that some students need different visual conditions, when schools are willing to be flexible in how a classroom is arranged, many barriers can be removed. But for that to happen, difference must first be seen as a need, not as a deficiency. This mismatch in school also carries an unspoken message that children are extremely sensitive to that the world isn't entirely meant for them. When a child has to work harder just to reach what is considered normal, a sense of not belonging can form very early, and that feeling doesn't only affect academic outcomes, it shapes how a child sees themselves, their worth, and their place in the community. Here the issue isn't the light itself. Light is simply the most visible expression of a larger logic, the logic of designing for the majority. When society assumes one kind of body as the default, those outside the default carry the cost of adaptation. That cost isn't always measurable in money, but in mental energy, accumulated fatigue, and opportunities that quietly shrink over time. Seen this way, the story of classroom lighting is no longer a minor detail. It becomes a clear example of how decisions that seem neutral can produce invisible inequality. And from those small details, a larger question begins to form. Can a society be called fair if it only happens to fit certain bodies, while other bodies must constantly adjust just to keep up? The consequence is that many children with albinism must expend more effort to achieve the same academic results. Not because their cognitive ability is lower, but because the learning environment is not optimized for their bodies. When fatigue accumulates, when reading and seeing become a burden, the joy of learning can be worn down. And when support doesn't arrive in time, a child may gradually withdraw from school itself, carrying with them the sense that they don't belong in a place that is supposed to be a doorway to opportunity. Beyond the classroom, the world of work presents similar challenges. Many jobs require outdoor labor, direct exposure to sunlight, or strict visual demands. When workplaces are not flexible, people with albinism are forced to rule out certain careers, not because they lack ability, but because the system fails to adapt. These barriers are rarely recorded as discrimination, because they are masked under the label of job requirements. Alongside physical challenges are subtler social pressures. A world not designed for you is also a world that constantly makes you explain your existence. Repeated questions about your skin, your hair, your eyes may begin as harmless curiosity, but over time they accumulate into psychological weight. Constantly having to explain that you are not sick, not mysterious, not a symbol of some special story turns difference into the center of every social interaction. In public spaces, unwanted attention is almost impossible for many people with albinism to avoid. It isn't always an angry look, and it doesn't necessarily come from an intention to harm. Often it is simply eyes that linger longer than they should, a second glance over the shoulder unconscious, pointing paired with a small, whispered question. But precisely because these behaviors are considered harmless, they are harder to recognize as a real burden. A look repeated often enough stops being a single moment. It becomes a condition, a sense that your presence is always being registered, always being evaluated, always being measured against standards you didn't create. When you enter a shared space on a bus, in a store, at a park, you are not only moving through a physical environment. You are moving through a field of social observation. Every step carries an awareness that you are being seen differently from the majority. Unconscious pointing, especially from children, is often defended by adults as natural curiosity. And it's true, curiosity isn't always malicious. But for the person being pointed at, becoming the object of curiosity again and again can create the feeling of being reduced to a single trait. Instead of being seen as a whole person, you are seen through the lens of skin, hair, eyes. The human being behind those traits begins to fade. Whispers that seem harmless also shape this experience more than people realize. They are often not spoken loudly enough to become a direct conversation, but loud enough for the person being mentioned to notice. That ambiguity makes them hard to respond to. You can't easily challenge a sentence that isn't said to your face, and so you carry it in silence as part of what it means to exist in public. All of these elements combine into the sensation of being constantly watched. Not watched in the sense of security, but watched in the social sense. When your body becomes something that draws attention, it becomes difficult to fully relax in shared spaces that are supposed to belong to everyone. Even something as simple as sitting on a bench, waiting for a ride, or taking a walk becomes more tense because you are not only present, you are being looked at. Privacy in its most basic sense becomes fragile. Privacy isn't only about having a closed personal space, it is also the right not to be excessively noticed in public, the right to blend in without explanation, the right to exist without becoming a special case. When that right is eroded, people may begin to adjust their behavior, choosing less crowded routes, avoiding rush hour, limiting time in busy places. Those choices aren't always visible from the outside, but they gradually shrink the world of the person living them. What matters is that most people who create this unwanted attention do not intend to harm. They don't realize that their gaze repeated hundreds of times a day can become a form of pressure. That lack of awareness reflects a gap in how society understands privacy and human diversity. When one group is always seen because they stand out, society forgets that being seen is not the same as being respected. Over time, the state of being constantly observed can shape the way someone sees themselves. When you repeatedly encounter yourself reflected in other people's reactions, you may begin to internalize those reactions. You learn to look at yourself the way others look at you. And when the social gaze is tightly tied to difference, maintaining a natural sense of self becomes harder. Here, the problem isn't individual curiosity. The problem is that society hasn't learned how to keep curiosity from becoming a burden for someone else. A truly inclusive society isn't one where no one ever notices difference. It's one where attention doesn't turn into pressure, where people can exist in shared spaces without trading away their privacy. For many people with albinism, learning how to stay out of sight becomes a survival skill, not hiding out of shame, but out of exhaustion. Exhaustion from being turned into an accidental biology lesson for others. Exhaustion from knowing that every appearance can become another round of questions. In an ideal world, your presence would not require an explanation. In reality, difference forces you to constantly negotiate with society's gaze. Even healthcare systems built to care for people are not always a good fit. In many places, knowledge of albinism among frontline healthcare workers is limited. Early screening for skin and eye issues may not be consistently available. Basic items such as sunscreen protective eyewear or vision support are not always accessible or subsidized. When healthcare becomes a financial burden, health risk stops being a long-term concern and becomes an immediate reality. Living in a world not designed for you also means becoming someone who is constantly self-adjusting. Adjusting your schedule to avoid intense sun. Adjusting clothing to protect your skin. Adjusting your home environment to reduce glare. Adjusting other people's expectations and sometimes even your own. That adaptation requires energy, time, and patience that society rarely sees. And what matters is that most of these difficulties are not impossible to address. They don't require complex technology or enormous cost. More flexible lighting design, basic education about biological diversity, early and consistent healthcare access. Public spaces built on the assumption that humans are not identical. These changes are fully achievable, but they only happen when the existence of people with albinism is understood as a normal part of society, not as a rare exception. Living in a world not designed for you doesn't have to be a sentence. It can become a reminder that social design is always a choice. What is considered normal is not an unchanging truth. It is the outcome of historical, cultural, and political decisions. When society expands its definition of normal, it doesn't only benefit people with albinism. Anyone outside the default template for any reason gets seen and accounted for. In the end, the question is not how well people with albinism can adapt to a world not made for them. The question is how willing society is to change so that this world becomes more inclusive of every form of human existence. Because a truly humane world is not one where everyone is the same. It is one where difference no longer means living in a constant state of adaptation just to be allowed to exist. Modern science has come a very long way in explaining albinism. Questions that once could only be answered through myth can now be approached through genes, enzymes, cells, and specific biological mechanisms. We know what albinism is. We know why it happens. We know how it affects the body. At the level of knowledge, albinism is no longer a mystery, but scientific understanding, no matter how accurate, still represents only half the story. The other half turning that understanding into a lived reality that is safe, fair, and properly supported, still contains many gaps. At the biological level, science has clearly established that albinism is a group of inherited conditions related to the production of melanin. Genetic variants that affect the enzymes involved in this biochemical pathway can reduce or prevent melanin from being produced. The main consequences appear in the skin, hair, and eyes, where melanin helps protect against light and supports visual function. There is nothing supernatural in it. There is no hidden power. There is no evidence that albinism is linked to intelligence or heightened perception in any systematic way. Science has stated that plainly, but science often stops at describing and explaining. It answers what is happening and why is it happening. It does not automatically answer the question of what society should do next. The gap between knowledge and action is exactly where many people with albinism continue to struggle, even in societies with advanced healthcare. A clear example is preventive medical care. Science knows that people with albinism face higher risk of sun-related skin damage and specific vision problems. That is not a secret. And yet in many places, routine screening access to sunscreen protective eyewear or vision support are still not fully integrated into primary health care. Knowledge exists in textbooks and scientific journals, but it is not always translated into policy budgeting and concrete services. Even in highly developed health systems, albinism can still be treated as rare, and what is rare is often deprioritized. Frontline doctors may not be trained in depth on the specific needs involved. Treatment guidelines may exist, but not be widely disseminated. And when knowledge is not consistently updated, patients are forced to become the ones explaining their own condition, an expectation not everyone is prepared for or able to carry. In education, the distance between understanding and enough becomes even more obvious. Vision science has long shown that many people with albinism have difficulty seeing at a distance or regulating light exposure. But education systems are rarely designed to be flexible around these differences. Adjusting classroom lighting, providing larger font materials, changing seating arrangements, or extending testing time can make a major difference. Yet those adjustments often depend on the awareness of individual teachers, rather than being standardized at the system level. Here science finished its part of the work a long time ago. The problem is that scientific understanding has not been translated into social design. A society that truly understands enough is not one that merely knows what albinism is, but one that knows how schools, workplaces, and public spaces should function, so that this difference does not become a disadvantage. Science communication has its own limitations as well. Even when reliable sources exist, scientific information often cannot compete with sensational or mysterious narratives. An article explaining enzyme pathways rarely spreads as quickly as a post claiming special abilities. And when science is not told in accessible language, that empty space is quickly filled by speculation and misunderstanding. This creates a modern paradox. We live in the age of the most information, but not necessarily the most understanding. Scientific information about albinism may be only one click away, yet the ability to access it, comprehend it, and trust it depends on many other factors: education level, cultural beliefs, and personal experience. When science is not integrated into everyday life, it can feel like a distant voice, not strong enough to replace stories that have already become familiar. Another area that modern science has only begun to address is the psychosocial impact of albinism. Research on mental health, on experiences of exclusion, on the effects of unwanted attention, remains limited compared to purely biological research. To understand albinism is not only to understand melanin, but to understand how society's response to the absence of melanin affects a human life. In that domain, science has only touched the surface. Not enough also shows up in the way policy is built. In many places, albinism does not fit neatly into existing support frameworks, never entirely classified as a disability, yet also not treated as a condition that requires no support. That ambiguity leaves many people in a policy blind spot, not eligible for assistance, while still facing real practical barriers. Science can classify with precision, but policy often needs clearer boundaries in order to act. On a wider level, modern science reveals something crucial. Understanding does not automatically produce change. Progress in knowledge does not guarantee progress in society without mechanisms of transfer, moving from laboratories into classrooms, from journal articles into public policy, from data into the design of everyday life. In the story of albinism, we are standing at exactly that intersection. We know a great deal, and yet we still do not do enough. What is needed in the next stage is not a dramatic biological breakthrough, but a coordinated effort to bring what we already know into reality. Training teachers to recognize different visual needs, equipping primary healthcare with the knowledge and basic tools required, telling the scientific story in more accessible language, and most importantly, placing people with albinism at the center of decisions that affect them rather than treating them only as research subjects. Modern science has helped us move away from myth. But to move away from injustice, we need more than science. We need social will empathy organized into action, and an understanding that knowledge only truly matters when it makes human life safer and easier to live. In the story of albinism, we have understood a great deal. But as long as the distance between knowledge and lived reality remains, that understanding is still not enough. When this story reaches its ending, perhaps the most important thing is not what we have discovered about albinism, but what we still need to remove the layers of myth, the distorted interpretations, even the praise that sounds positive, but still pushes people outside the ordinary place they deserve to inhabit. Albinism is not a superpower. It is not a sign of something higher, deeper, or more mysterious. It is also not a curse, an omen, or a symbol. Albinism is simply one way of existing among countless ways human biology can unfold a rare genetic variation, but one that carries no supernatural message. And here, a crucial shift needs to happen in the way we tell the story. When society stops searching for a grand meaning inside difference, we can begin to see the real person behind it. When we stop asking what makes them special, we can finally ask the questions that matter. What do they need to live safely? What makes their lives harder? What can society change so they are not forced to adapt alone? Existence does not need justification. A person does not need a superpower to deserve protection. They do not need to represent something extraordinary to be respected. They do not need to be rare to be noticed, and they do not need to be exceptional to be cared for. The right to live safely, to learn to work, to move through public space without fear or pressure. This is not a reward for being different. It is the foundation of a humane society. Looking back across the entire journey of this story, from biology and evolution to myth to modern life, one truth becomes clear. The hardships people with albinism face do not originate in their bodies, but in the environment around them, in worlds designed for the majority, in stories told without them at the center, in unconscious assumptions about what counts as normal. Science has helped us understand that albinism contains no mystery, but society is still learning to accept that not every difference needs to be mythologized. The maturity of a society is not measured by how curious it is about what is unusual, but by whether it can allow what is unusual to exist without turning it into a burden. Perhaps the most important step forward is not to write more stories about albinism, but to allow people with albinism to tell their own stories as individuals, with lives that are rich, complex, ordinary, and deeply human. Not as symbols, not as metaphors, but as people living in the same world, sharing the same basic needs for safety, dignity, and belonging. When we stop here, what remains is not a mystery to solve, but a simple reminder the world does not need more myth to become meaningful. It needs more spaces designed so that everyone can live in them without having to constantly adapt just to exist. Not a superpower, not a symbol, just existence. And that on its own is enough. And as this story comes to a close, perhaps what lingers is not a mystery waiting to be solved, but a deeply human question. Have you ever met a person with albinism? Maybe a friend, an acquaintance, or a face you once passed on the street? And if you have, how did you see them in that moment? We often believe that the biggest stories live in the extraordinary, but sometimes the most meaningful reflection lies in how an ordinary human being learns to exist in a world that was never designed with them in mind. No superpowers, no symbolism, just the right to live, to be safe, and to be respected. If this story caused you to slow down even a little, if it helped you look at difference with a gentler gaze, then I invite you to leave a comment below. Tell me, where are you listening to this story from? What time is it where you are right now? And if you have ever had an experience, a thought, or a question about albinism, please share it, even if it's just a single line. If you found this content meaningful, don't forget to press like to support the channel and subscribe if you'd like to continue traveling with us through stories of history, science, and humanity, told at a slower pace, to listen, to understand, and to reflect before sleep. Thank you for staying with us until the very last moment. Wishing you a quiet night, and hoping that somewhere out there, the world is slowly becoming easier to live in for everyone.